Jeriel and Jalen using their gifts to minister in music, and they both lead in our Rooted Young Adults, our college class, and I appreciate the gifting that God gives to people. Jeriel's a communication major. He's the men's student body president, but uses his gifts musically in the local church. And that's what's so exciting about a local church, is just seeing, as Rob prayed, all these different gifts and abilities and spiritual gifts that God gives us coming together, coalescing, and then as we meet on the Lord's Day together as the body of Christ, we then go out into the world. Rob is a pilot, and this week was a little bit interesting. It made me start to realize my age. On Tuesday, I was doing premarital counseling for this young couple, and he's an airline pilot, and she's a flight attendant. That's actually how they met. And I'm looking at them, and I'm trying not to smile. And I think they thought it was a little weird why I had this big grin on my face. And finally, I said, "You guys just seem so young. It's hard for me to imagine I'm getting on a plane, and the pilot could be as young as you guys." And I said, yesterday, my wife and I went to meet our new accountants. Our accountant up in Indiana retired, and so we had to find new accountants. And both of these guys are 10 or 15 years younger than we are, and that seemed really weird. And then later that day, my wife took our youngest son to the doctor, and she said the doctor walks in and introduces himself, and his first name is Parker. And she's thinking, "You're just way too young to be a doctor." And so part of that's just the aging process, but you realize God gives gifts and abilities to believers that we can use in the workplace. And that's what we've been seeing in this series on a theology of vocation, your work matters, that God isn't concerned just with those in full-time Christian ministry, so-called pastors, Christian school teachers, missionaries, but God is using each of us in the workplace, wherever he's placed us, for his glory. In his book on Christians and culture called Roaring Lambs, Robert Briner writes, "There should be no less support or attention for an earnest Christian young person who's been accepted to Juilliard School of Music than for one going off to theological seminary. The church needs writers, performers, artists, speakers, politicians, businessmen, businesswomen, and workers in every craft and trade. We could say accountants and pilots. In God's eyes, there should be no hierarchy. There certainly should not be. In God's eyes, there should be no hierarchy. There certainly should not be in ours." And part of the reason for that, part of the reason he can make this kind of statement, is because of what we saw last week, that Christ changes how you work. That if you're a believer, no longer do you work with eyeservice, where you're doing your job, but you have one eye on the clock, or one eye on the boss, or one eye on your phone and your social media. But Paul says, no, that we're supposed to work with singleness of heart. And then he says, not as menpleasers, but fearing God, that we do our work ultimately out of a fear of God, not just a fear of what the client or the customer or my boss will think of me. Well, so last week we saw Christ changes how you work. This week in the same text, we want to see that Christ changes why you work. What motivates you to work? Is it a paycheck? Is it a bonus? Is it a retirement package? If so, when you become a believer, you should have a new motivation. So what is our motivation now that we're Christians? Look with me at verse 24. "Knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of your inheritance." And Greek scholars would say that's an epexegetical genitive, that it's really the inheritance as your reward, that the two it's in apposition. "For ye serve the Lord Christ." So we often think of eternal rewards, crowns in heaven going to evangelists, those who are witnessing, or those who are persevering, or those who are pastoring, or those who are being martyred. But Paul says, no, all the work that you do unto the Lord will receive reward. Now, if you're doing those things for anything other than the Lord, then it's just wood, hay, and stubble that's ultimately going to be burned up. But if you're doing it for the Lord with Jesus Christ as the foundation, it will be gold and silver and precious stones. These are rewards that rust and moth and thieves can't destroy, that are laid up for you in heaven. So the incentive here is greater than any retirement plan, any stock options, any 401k, that when you change your boss to the Lord, he also promises great reward. Notice Paul doesn't say the Lord Jesus. Jesus, we know, means God saves. He says the Lord Christ. The Lord, who is Christ, means the Messiah, the King, the Master. Now, this would have had great meaning for first century slaves, because your worth as a slave depended on whom you were a slave to. Who was your boss? Who was your master? Paul says, you are serving the King of Kings. Does that help you put into perspective that even the most mundane tasks in life, cleaning up after someone, changing diapers, inputting information into spreadsheets, no matter how mundane, no matter how trivial your work seems, it now has new meaning and value because of who you're doing it for. My brother-in-law is the youngest of 3 boys, and his oldest brother, after he finished college, joined the Secret Service. And so a number of years ago, his older brother, Will, was standing outside one of the lawns of the White House really late at night, actually into the wee hours of the morning, and here is Will standing there, and all of a sudden the President of the United States, George W. Bush, comes out with his dog, Barney. Even the president has to take the dog out at night. And Will would tell this story about sitting there, and there he is chatting with George W. Bush as little Barney does his business. And you think, here's this grown man, this tall, intelligent, really sharp guy, and one of his work stories that he's so proud of is watching a Scottish Terrier do its business. You say, why would he care about that? Well, it's because this dog belongs to the President of the United States. That's who he's serving. So it's not just any Scottish Terrier. It's not just any dog that he would risk his life in the middle of the night to protect. It's the President of the United States. The most mundane task now it has new dignity when it's done for the President. And your work has immense value, no matter how small or mundane it may seem. Why? Because you're doing it for Christ the King. Christ gives the most menial labor of a slave dignity and worth. But beyond that, not only does he give it worth, he says, I'm promising there is eternal reward that you will receive on top of that. Do you see how this truth could revolutionize your life? I mean, you think about what are some of the main reasons people give for why they get discouraged at work. Probably number one would be, well, I have a bad boss. Paul says, then change your boss. Quit working for your boss. Start working instead for the Lord Jesus Christ. Do your work as unto the Lord. It doesn't matter what your boss is like. We saw last week, this is written to slaves. It doesn't matter what your master's like. Do your work as unto the Lord. You say, yeah, but he doesn't pay me well. Or she doesn't give me the compensation or the credit I deserve. Paul would say, okay, then change your compensation plan. Start working for something greater than a 401k. Start working for the eternal reward that Jesus promises. Now, on the flip side of this, if you are a believer and you would say, yes, Jesus Christ is my ultimate boss, then when you don't work to the best of your ability, when you don't work single-heartedly, as we saw last week, wholeheartedly, because you don't think your compensation is sufficient, or you don't think that you're given the credit that you deserve, or you don't think your boss is worthy of your best effort, then aren't you really sinning against God? I mean, aren't you, in a sense, rebelling not just against your human boss, sticking it to the man? Aren't you, in a sense, rebelling against God who gave you your job? In 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel the priest is bummed out. He is singing the blues. And the reason is because God's people said, we don't want a priest anymore. I mean, he basically isn't going to have job security. They say, we don't want your position anymore. We want a king to rule over us like all the other nations have. And so Samuel's complaining to the Lord, and he says, Lord, they're rejecting me. And in verse 7, God says, no, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. God says, and they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. When you refuse to serve your earthly boss or refuse to work wholeheartedly for your employer, the authority that God has placed in your life, you're really not rejecting just your boss, you're rejecting God. You say, wow, Paul's really ratcheting up the guilt on these poor slaves. No, actually, this is incredibly liberating. When you start to view your work as not just for a cruel master or a mean boss or an inept manager. Instead, you are working for a different audience. You're now performing your work. You're doing this work not for the boss, not for the slave master, not for the inept manager. You're doing this work for the Lord. You're working for a different retirement plan, for eternal reward. That elevates your work. No longer is it mundane or menial or small. No longer is it compulsory work. Now it's being done for eternal reward with joyful service. When the slave decides to work for the Lord, in a sense, he's no longer a slave. He is now an employee of the king. Someone was watching Mother Teresa care for lepers with their putrid open sores and stinking bodies and bleeding wounds, and they looked at that and they were so repulsed, they said to Mother Teresa, I wouldn't do what you do for $1 million. And a broad smile stretched across Mother Teresa's wizened face, and she said, neither would I. She wouldn't do that work for just $1 million. She was doing it for a different motive. Christ changes why we work. We're doing it for Him. We're doing it for eternal reward. But not only does God address the servants, or we might say in 21st century nomenclature, the employees, He also addresses the masters. So for those of you who are bosses or you're in management and you've been kind of saying amen under your breath, now Paul puts the bullseye on you. Now he flips the relationship and says Christ also changes. Not only does Christ change how you work, He changes why you work. But He also changes how you treat your workers. Look at verse 25. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. So first of all, Paul says, look, God is not impressed by rank. He's not impressed by CEOs, by billionaires. He's impartial. That word, no respecter of persons, is actually a pretty cool word picture. It literally means no lifting up of the face. And you know how we can tend to be that maybe we hear someone comes in and they start asking us something. Maybe you've done customer service before, and you wait and you look up and see, who am I talking to? And then you decide how pleasant you're going to be. Then you decide what kind of answer you're going to give them. Maybe you've heard people who answer the phone with this really sweet, polite voice. Good afternoon, this is so-and-so. And then all of a sudden, depending on who's on the other end of the line, their voice changes. Oh, it's you, honey. And their voice kind of drops an octave. It's just my spouse. I don't really care about that. That Paul is saying here, God doesn't look up. He's not a respecter of persons. He doesn't lift up his face to see who he's talking to. I haven't seen that show about The Masked Singer, but apparently I saw a news story about some famous female singer who'd won 10 Grammys, and she got kicked off, and they take the mask off, and they realize, wow, this is who that person was. God says, look, I don't look at who it is and then make a determination, and neither should you. You say, well, what does that mean for bosses? That we shouldn't play favorites. But then Paul goes on in chapter 4, verse 1, the next verse. He says, Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. So God is watching the way that you treat your employees. And God says, look, remember, you have an ultimate boss that you're going to answer to. Know that you have a master who's in heaven. He says, masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal. Now, the word just is simply the legal obligation. This is what you have to give them. What's interesting is that the word give is not just like, well, here you go. It really means to furnish, to provide, to grant what someone needs. If you're a boss, then you should provide for your workers what they need, what they deserve. Compensate them generously. So just is the legal obligation. If I am a boss and I have an employee who puts in overtime, then I am legally obligated to pay them time and a half for that overtime. That's the law. But the word equal goes even further. Equal refers to the moral obligation. And the word equal here is really the picture of a scale that both sides should equal out. If my workers have done what is required of them, then I should do what is required of me. If my workers go above and beyond, then I should go above and beyond. There should be equity in how I remunerate them. There should be equity in how I treat them. If my goal as a boss is only making money, then I'm probably going to be tempted to pay my employees as little as possible. I'm not going to really be concerned with equity, with equality, or fairness. But if I say, no, I want to give them an equitable portion of what they deserve. If they help my business grow, if they work hard, if they do extra projects, then I want to give them extra. I want to give them a share of the profits. They should benefit from what they've done to help me. There should be equity. Several years ago, when my girls were little, I noticed that they had made a really big mess in their room. And so I went in and I said, girls, you need to help me. We need to clean up the room before Mom gets home. She had taken the baby at the time, Micah, to the store, and she was coming home. I said, we've got to clean up this room. And so I get down on my hands and knees, and I start collecting puzzle pieces and trying to put them together. And Tessa, the younger daughter, gets down, and she tackles Mrs. Potato Head and is getting all the body parts from Mrs. Potato Head and putting them back inside of her. And Karis, our oldest daughter, picked up this little megaphone that she'd gotten from our Christian school when she'd been a cheerleader one night, this little red plastic megaphone, and she starts singing this song into the megaphone. Clean up, everybody, everywhere. Clean up, everybody, do your share. I guess there's a Barney song that she had heard. And finally, after hearing her sing to us for about a minute, I finally said, Karis, why don't you help clean up? Why don't you do your share? And she just looked at me like she couldn't believe the question I was asking. And she pointed to the megaphone. She said, Dad, I only have one hand. What can I do? As bosses, verse 1 says, masters, it's not enough to just do the bare legal requirement, that there should be equality, that you should do what's equal, what's fair. You should pitch in and do your part. If anything, Christian bosses should go above and beyond. What's interesting is that we look at this letter to the Colossians. This is not the first letter that Paul has sent to the town of Colossae. There was actually a church member there at Colossae who had received a personal letter from Paul. If you look at chapter 4, verse 9, look who Paul has sent a previous letter to, another letter that was sent in the New Testament. In chapter 4, verse 9, we read that he was sending this letter via the hand of a couple of men. One of them is Onesimus. You say, well, who's Onesimus? Well, Paul had sent another letter with Onesimus, not to the church here at Colossae, but to a member of the church named Philemon, who was Onesimus' master. Onesimus was a runaway slave. And Paul writes this brief letter to Philemon, and he says, look, even though he stole from you, even though he ran away, even though you could have him branded or killed, I want you as a Christian boss to make sure that you treat Onesimus well. For my sake, treat Onesimus as my son. Don't treat him as just a slave. Treat him as better than that. As Christian bosses, we should go above and beyond. Now, if you had someone who stole from you and then ran away, and you had legal recourse you could take against that person, you'd probably be tempted to say, I'm going to take all the law and throw it at him. But as Christians, we're held to a higher standard. As Christians, we shouldn't engage in lawsuits with other Christians. It besmirches the testimony of Christ when you have two churches in the same city who are countersuing each other, and all these lawsuits that affect the reputation of Christ in a community. And so Paul says to Philemon, look, as a Christian boss, you go the extra mile. You go above and beyond for Onesimus. This week we had a local business owner who made our facilities manager a very unusual proposition. Tim Soleil is the Christian owner of Palmetto Painting and Coatings business, and he called our facilities manager, Steve Wright, and he said, can I send a team of professional painters to your church to do whatever painting projects that you need done for free? And so Steve Wright, as a shrewd facilities manager, said, do you mean free? And Tim said, free. He said, this is a less busy time of the year for my company, and yet I want all of my employees to get their regular pay. And so if we don't have paying clients giving us work, I'll contact churches and offer our services for free so that I can still pay my employees. I would recommend their company, that a Christian boss who's willing to say, I want to keep paying my employees, even if I'm not getting income, but I want to make sure they get paid, and so I'm willing to offer our services free to churches. That's the kind of Christian boss that we should be. Dan Beatles last week gave a testimony at the end of the service and told about a boss who he said was godly, who was gentle, but was also generous. And when Kim Huffman, now one of our missionaries and church planners, when she was in a car accident and didn't know if her insurance was going to pay for her medical expenses, he, as her boss, anonymously paid out of his own pocket, Dan told us about, to take care of his employee. How do you treat those who work under you? Do you give them a fair wage? Do you provide benefits as you're able? Do you treat them with respect? Do you know anything about their families and about their needs? Or are you like the old Ebenezer Scrooge with Bob Cratchit, who barely even give him a piece of coal to warm himself? Or are you like the new Scrooge with Tiny Tim, who wants to know about the medical needs of his employee? He wants to do what he can to help provide for their families. Do you treat them the way you want your master to treat you? Because that's what verse 1 says. That we have a boss in heaven, a master in heaven. He's watching us as bosses and managers and employers down here, and we're going to give an account to him. Christ changes how you work, he changes why you work, and he changes how you treat your workers. Back in the 1988 Olympics in Calgary, American speed skater Dan Jansen was favored to win both the 500 and the 1,000-meter races. But early in the morning of his two races, he was informed that his sister Jane was dying of leukemia. Later that day, he received the news that she had died. And so Dan Jansen began both of these races with record-breaking speed, but in both races he fell and didn't even medal. In 1992, again, he was the favorite. He had just set a world record going into the Olympics, and this time he wanted to win gold in memory of his sister, but again, he came up empty in the world for a world record that he was trying to set. In 1994, he comes to his fourth and final Olympics. Now, Jansen is the underdog. He's late in his career, and yet he's able to win gold in the 1,000 meters, and he set a world record. And some of us who are old enough to remember this emotional victory lap, where he skated around the rink with his 9-month-old daughter named Jane in honor of his sister who had died. Well, after the Olympics, Jansen was asked, how in the world could you overcome that kind of adversity? How could, after losing in 3 different Olympics, when you were favored to win, when you were the overdog, how do you come in to your final Olympics as the underdog after 16 years of Olympic failure, how did you win the gold medal? And he reflected back and he told a story. He said, I was 12 years old and my dad had driven me in the pickup truck to a meet and I was supposed to win and I had lost the meet. He said, on the way home, I was pouting the whole way and my dad just didn't say anything, never said a word. We get home, I go up to my room, I get ready for bed, and right before bedtime that evening, he said, my dad walked in the room, and this was all he said. He said, son, life is more than skating in circles. And then he walked out. And Jansen said that one comment changed, it revolutionized my whole perspective in life. Now, he didn't quit skating in circles. He kept doing that really well. He was one of the best in the world. But now he saw the bigger picture. Now he saw that life was more than just that thing that he was doing. As mundane as that sounded, the way his dad put it, just skating in circles, that it was more than that he saw there was a bigger picture to life. And as Christians, we need to do the same thing, that making Christ the Lord of your life means as students, pay attention in class. Not just to get an A, not just to maintain a 4.0, but do it for the Lord. As musicians, practice your instrument, not just so that you can be first chair, but because Christ is first place in your life, because he's the one that you're doing it for. Kids, put your toys away, or turn off your phone, or obey what your parents ask you to do. Why? Because think of if Jesus asked you to do that. Are you doing what you do as unto the Lord? Are you doing it for Jesus? Your work has meaning, no matter how mundane it may seem. A parent changing diapers, a mechanic greasing some part, an accountant inputting numbers into a spreadsheet. Your work is worship when it's done for the Lord, and it will receive eternal reward. Most of us in this room will probably never be considered as great as Dan Jansen. Probably very few of us, maybe none of us, will grace the covers of magazines or be recorded in the history books. But all of us can do our work, whatever God's called us to do, even the most menial job, even for the worst boss in the world. We can do it as unto the Lord because Christ changes how you work. You don't have to work always watching your boss or the clock or your phone. Instead, you can work single-heartedly, focused on what you're doing because you're doing it unto the Lord. If you have a boss who doesn't exemplify some of these Christian character traits, you can change your boss in a sense. You can do your work as unto the Lord. If you're not content with maybe the compensation package or the credit that you get at work, remember, I'm working for eternal reward. I'm working to lay up treasure in heaven, not just for my 401k down here. Christ changes why you work. You have a different incentive, a different retirement plan, and eternal reward. And Christ changes how you treat your workers because you have a master in heaven. Part of what we want to do with this series is help find the intersection in our lives, in the workplace, and our faith. And so I have asked a number of different men, and we'll have women who are in the workplace come and share a testimony of how this particular text applied to their life, and a story that will help us kind of enfleshen and visualize how we can do our work as unto the Lord. So I've asked Jeff Darst, who's a local small business owner here in town, if he would come, and he's going to share a testimony with us. After that, Pastor Huffman is going to come and give us some instruction on the Pizza Fellowship afterwards. Jeff.
Good evening. I was when Pastor asked me to say a word, I was of course honored when he sent me I think he sent me an email asking me. But then I started looking at the schedule, and I realized that right after me is a pizza social. And I know how much people love pizza, and I know what people dislike even more than that is anybody that stands in the way of them in pizza. So I'm starting to think Pastor might be using me as a buffer between him and you all tonight. But regardless, I will be short and brief. But just a little history of myself. I've been at this church for 20-something years. But I've been in the workforce for probably 35 years. I started working quite young, like everybody else does, cutting grass, things like that. Only 8 of those have been as an employee, and the rest of those have been self-employed in some kind of capacity. So that's really what I relate to more than as an employee, but I do have some things to speak to, and we'll talk about that as well. So I own a plumbing company here locally, and then also an insurance firm. I've been blessed over the years. I've had just many positive influences in my life. I don't have any stories of coming off of the streets and, picking myself up on bootstraps and things like that. I've always had just great examples in my life. To start with, kind of starting early, I had my parents taught me a very, very strong work ethic, and like any parent, they were not at all perfect people, but one thing that I took away that I kept with me for the rest of my life was the work ethic that they instilled in me as a very young child. And my kids will tell you that I demand that same kind of work ethic out of them. I'm very proud of how hard my kids work and the things that they do. The folks that have worked for me in the past, I demand the same thing out of them as well. But that just comes down from parents that instilled that in me, and I am thankful for that. I've been married a very long time, I think 28 years maybe. My wife sent me I'm struggling with the math. My wife sent me a text on Valentine's Day and said this is our 33rd Valentine's together. And we dated like 6 years or something. We started dating in 11th grade. So, but my wife has an amazing work ethic. Some of you have dealt with her in relation to that. Also, very gentle, very kind, and that's more what she has probably brought to the table for me. Is over the years she's kind of chipped away at the rough part of me. I tend to see things very black and white, and she sees things through a different lens, and that's been very helpful in my dealings with people that have worked with me. She came from my in-laws who are here tonight, and they've also had to deal with me for 33 years, but I've watched them over the years too, and some of the kindest people that I've known, and I've watched various situations. My father-in-law was administrator of a Christian school, and I've seen different situations and the way that he responded. Those were all examples to me. And then some of those years when I did have bosses, they were both Christian gentlemen, believers who had a huge impact on me during the time that I worked for them. They were always fair, always went above and beyond. They demanded much out of me, but also rewarded much out of me. And a lot of the things that I've tried to do with folks that have worked with me have been a result of them. And part of the point of telling you all of that is whether you're an employer, an employee, and if you don't have that kind of background, and I'm very, very grateful for it, try to attach yourselves to somebody that can help you with those areas. Try to get a mentor or something else like that, maybe you didn't have that same experience. There's a lot of godly people out there that can help. As I started thinking about the relationship between an employee and employer, I kind of realized, the Bible does address very specific passages as Pastor has been going through. But really, in the end, there's nothing special about it. It's simply your relationship with other people. And there's a litany of verses, obviously, about how we are to treat people under all circumstances. It doesn't necessarily differentiate an employer and employee. It just speaks about people in general. And I think that's an important point. Some of those verses, and I'm just going to read them real quick. Ephesians 4:32, and be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. Luke 6:31, and as ye would men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. John 15:12, this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. 1 Peter 3:8-9, finally be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. And then Philippians 2:4, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. So it doesn't really matter whether you're an employer, an employee, husband, wife, parent, child, friend, colleague. How you treat people is addressed in all those verses. The employee term is something I've never really liked. It's not something that I use. I've always considered most of these people friends and partners in the endeavors that I've done. And I'm very blessed to have wonderful people that have worked with me. And that's really the angle I wanted to focus on tonight was I just want to talk about 3 different people that I've had the pleasure of working with. And I don't think any of them are here. Many of y'all probably know them. But the point is, and I do believe honor should be given where honor's due, but more the point is if you are an employee, hopefully just with some of these stories that I tell, you will take things from that maybe you can apply to the situation, in your own work. The first one is my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, his name is Sam, and he manages the plumbing company for me. And he's just been a great asset. He's like anybody else, and we've all been through that, different phases in our lives where sometimes you struggle, sometimes you're having victory over things, and he came to know the Lord several years ago, but it was after we thought he already knew the Lord. So when we saw a dramatic change in his life at that time. But he takes care of all facets, really, of that business for me. He takes care of all the technicians, and he cares very deeply for these gentlemen. It's really amazing to see. I'm really in awe of him on that. He considers his work his ministry. These guys know that he truly cares about them. They also know if they step out of line, he's going to stick it to them as well. So it's not necessarily that you have to be soft, but once you show somebody that you care, they know that you care, in all situations, even when things maybe aren't going quite right. It's amazing to me how he is able to treat every single technician equally, which has been a big lesson in my life from watching him. And I've always tried to do that, but it's easy to say and not as easy to do. And I can just tell you that he treats every single technician the same. He doesn't play favorites at all. And if anybody here is involved in the service industry, sometimes you can get a wild crew of technicians sometimes. And we've had all kinds over the years. The group that we have now are the most amazing men that we've ever had before. But I mean, one time, 10 years ago, 12 years ago or something, I got a phone call. One of my technicians was driving down the interstate with a John boat sticking out the back of his box truck headed to a fishing hole. And needless to say, you're not really supposed to be hauling a John boat in the back of your truck. That's got our name all over the side of it and everything else. And so I could tell story after story of these gentlemen who, various things happen, yet my brother-in-law is able to treat every one of these gentlemen the same, plays no favorites whatsoever. It's concerned about every one of them. And then just another thing that he does for me personally is without ever telling me, he handles a lot of things that probably a lot of employees would say, well, that's the boss's job. Let him deal with it. Let him get that phone call. Let him get that text message. I don't get paid enough to do this, whatever the case might be. I've never heard that from my brother-in-law. He takes care of everything, and most things I find out about after the fact that there is a situation when he fills me in afterwards. But very, very good example of somebody who is working a Christ-centered focus on their job. Another gentleman that works with me, his parents are here, he's not here, is a gentleman named Zach who works with me at the insurance company. Zach is a dear person to me. I've watched him grow up since he was little. He came up through the youth group here and then went off to college. And then I've worked in the youth group my family's worked in the youth group for 20-something years. And this is just kind of a rabbit trail, but don't give up on the teenagers, okay? I know a lot of times as older folks, we see them around church, and some of them are sullen, and some of them are being silly, and some of them are accomplishing things, and some of them look like they're accomplishing nothing. And sometimes we have a tendency of writing some of these kids off, and just don't ever write a kid off. And Zach was just a wonderful example of that. I watched him grow up. He was, we just loved having him in the youth group. went through his period of time, that he had a struggle. And I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't say if he was here talking to you as well, but he went away from the Lord a little bit in his teen years, and then God got hold of his heart in college and just turned his life around once again. And he also is just very much like my brother-in-law. He's one of the kindest people that I know. He treats clients, doesn't matter who the client is. They all get treated equally. They all get his ear, however long that person needs him. He does whatever he can do to help somebody. It has nothing to do with whether he gets paid, doesn't get paid. Everybody in this room, we all do things that we don't get paid for. Some of us grumble about that. I've never heard a grumble out of Zach about any extra effort he ever has to put in. So he's another example of somebody that I deal with that I believe in the workforce honors Christ and everything he does. And then lastly, I just want to mention one other gentleman. I don't think he's here either, but Jeff Traver, who's one of our missionaries. Him and I have worked side by side for almost a year now. It started out working at the church house, and then he's been working just some personal projects for me for the past several months. But just another gentleman that is working for Christ. You can tell that he's working for Christ. Everything he does, I've never heard him complain. I am renowned for switching things on him, for we do one thing and maybe something's not quite the way I wanted it and I didn't communicate it right, so he just redoes it. I'll say something like, I wish I had an outlet over here, and I come home and there's an outlet. I didn't ask him to do an outlet. It's just he's always looking for anything extra he can do, never complains, just makes things happen, and always in good spirits. And all these gentlemen I'm speaking of here, always in good spirits. And we know y'all have the lives that, we all have our own lives, our own struggles and everything else, but every one of these gentlemen show up at work with a smile on their face. You wouldn't know sometimes the burdens that they might or might not be carrying, because they know that work is not the place for that. And so I think all these men deserve honor for that. So really in closing, the main thing is just always put others before yourself. Whether you're an employer, put your employees first. If you're an employee, put your employer first. Happens to be the same two people doing that, it's going to be a pretty awesome relationship. A lot of stuff's going to get done. A lot's going to be accomplished. It's going to be a great place to work. And then if it's not like that, then Pastor and what he spoke about tonight, as far as just the understanding of, well, you're not actually working for that boss, but you're working for Christ. You're working for your testimony. You're working for what others see around you who know that you go, whether it's to Morningside or some other church, things like that. So just always put people first. You might get burned a few times here or there. We've all had examples of, well, I went to help that person, and what did I get for it? And that's just going to happen. That's part of life. But in the end, we'll bring honor to Christ, bring out the best of people, and then it's amazing what you can accomplish in a workforce if you create an environment like that. So.
Thank you, Jeff. Part of what we want to encourage you all who are younger and thinking about your vocation, thinking about your future job to do, is to build connections and relationships with us in the church family. And for several years now, I've had a ministry mentoring class where we pair men who've been in the ministry with young men who are training or feel called to the ministry, but we want that to happen across the church. So if you are thinking about management in your future, talk to someone like Dan Beatles, who spoke last week. If you're thinking about becoming a small business owner or entrepreneur, talk to Jeff tonight at the Pizza Fellowship, or contact one of us. If you can't find them, say, hey, could you put me in touch with accountants in the church or pilots in the church or people in the medical profession in the church, so that we can help you, because a lot of what we do as believers is not just reading God's word and then interpreting God's word. That's what we as pastors and teachers are doing from the pulpit. But then the application of that word often happens in Christian community. And that's where we want you to have older role models and peers within whatever vocation you're called to. Education, computer industry, IT industry, whatever that is, to be able to say, how do I deal with this ethical dilemma? And I, on a regular basis, get calls from church members. Some of them are going to come up here and share some of those ethical dilemmas and how they worked through that biblically and theologically. But we want to give you that opportunity as any member, but especially young adults, college students, come talk to us. We'd love to set up those mentor relationships because, like Jeff said, that's vital to you learning not only the occupation God's called you to, but how to represent